welcome to Varn Blog. And today I'm joined by former teenage nihilist and Ph.D. student at University of Swansea, Stefan Bertram-Lee. And we're not going to talk about your prior experience in the YPG today. I'm sure you've been asked plenty about that. I'm just bringing it up to give you cred. And I'm sure my audience, the audience on this side of the pond, will also be impressed by your sophisticated accent. But know that my hatred of the English runs deep, and I am not fooled. So
I'm very charming, so I think it'll work out fine.
Yeah, you are. You've written a couple of things for Sublation recently that I've actually found very useful. My critique is the critique I have of every Sublation article, that they're about 1,000 words too short.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay, but I'm very laconic.
Well, that's good, I suppose. You fit right in there. So you wrote a kind of provocative article in the last couple weeks. What have the bourgeoisie done for us lately? Which I think seems to a lot of American leftists, and seems odd, because the historical role of the bourgeoisie is not something the American left really focuses on. In fact, the American left barely talks about the bourgeoisie or the elites except in the abstraction of capitalism as a whole. At all. I mean, they're more focused on weird subclasses like the PMC or whatever, which sometimes seems to stand in for the bourgeoisie and sometimes doesn't. So let's talk about why you've lost faith in the bourgeoisie, which I think from the standpoint of Britain even makes more sense than the United States, because your bourgeoisie seems to really, really suck. like even comparatively to the others.
Yeah. I mean, we've in the last year, obviously there's been, well, actually the last few years there's been a big crisis with obviously COVID going into Ukraine, but it's especially been the conflict in Ukraine, which has really brought out, I think, this week, though obviously we saw a lot of stuff during COVID where these businesses will basically just, you know, they took massive loans from the government and then didn't spend them and didn't employ people or hire people or whatever. They just kept the money and then hoped to be bailed out again in the future.
Which in the United States they were. So,
like,
you know,
in like a pure kind of rentier strategy. But as kind of the crisis in Ukraine developed, it obviously, the war started in February. We sanctioned Russia pretty much immediately. And then winter was going to come in about 6 months, as it does every year. every March, 6 months, 7 months later, winter happens. And obviously we knew that Russia was going to do some kind of fuckery with the gas that they supply us. Why shouldn't they? We're kind of doing our best to absolutely destroy them. Of course, they're going to kind of not just kindly keep us warm over winter. So we had, you know, these many, many months to prepare. And what did we do? Not much. It didn't really seem like that. And it wasn't kind of, it didn't seem that the state was holding back capital in any way in these months, but rather that capital was not seemingly interested in doing anything when they knew that there would be massive opportunity for profit. And the current kind of energy companies have made massive profits. Though again, it's often again from rentier kind of streams. For instance, I don't know how widely known this is, but in the UK we now have an energy price cap, which is basically just a cap that the average person pays per unit of electricity or gas or heating or whatever. It's all kind of within one bill. But this isn't paid by, you know, it's first off not just kind of like a direct imposement on the capitalists to like force them to lose money, which is happening with in France with their state-owned energy provider, where it's being forced to lose money, and it's not the state taking direct provision of these things. Rather, it's just throwing money into these companies. It's just giving them an absolute massive amount of money from the state on top of what they're getting from the people. And to be clear, this energy cap is still the highest price of energy paid anywhere in Europe. I think about double the nearest country, which is Ireland, who for Americans, this might seem strange, but in fact, the political economy of Ireland and Great Britain are almost the same.
I suppose this leads us to a couple of different questions. I mean, one, I have seen stats that saying Europe has finally invested in renewable energies in the way the UK is not, which is funny because everyone in the United States was like, well, Europe is taking global warming seriously. And I was like, yeah, by outsourcing its carbon outputs to Russia. Like, that's what it's been doing ever since it told Norway to pump slightly less natural gas.
Well, China also has these incredibly fake kind of carbon statistics, because if you make some cheap shit in China and then export it to Europe, and it's never used by anyone in China at all, how these things are counted, China gets all that CO2 counted, even though these things are only produced for the sake of Europe.
Mm. So yeah, there's all these kind of offset paper trail games. So the renewables are actually only coming now because they basically have to. You've been given a little bit of time, Europe as a whole, because you've had, unlike here, actually, we've had that kind of rough winter in the States, but in Europe, you've had a mild one.
Yeah, it's really all right outside right now.
Yeah. But it still seems like long term, there is no immediate viable solution except for in France. And I actually want to ask you why this is the case. Why are the SPD and the German Greens so unwilling to look at renuclearization? I realize there are problems with that. I don't think nuclear power is a fix-all, but France really is in a much better state than most of Europe because it has its operational nuclear power plants.
I mean, it's a real cultural foible, basically, and also kind of specifically structurally with the German Green Party. Mm-hmm. They're basically like one of their main things from basically their inception has been their opposition to nuclear power, and for like kind of a class of liberal German hippies, which make up a significant kind of voting bloc in Germany. Nuclear power is really not something to be countenanced. It really is kind of like a terrifying great saying, because of course, remember, the Germans don't have nuclear weapons, so of course they're full with American ones. Right. And yeah, it's just this. I think it's a very strong cultural opposition, and it is one of these inertial things where, especially because nuclear power takes a while to start and stop and so on, we're like, well, we've nearly killed it, and this is just like some mere temporary crisis. And we can just move on and not have to go back to scary, terrible nuclear power. But of course, this just means that Germany is burning absolutely insane amounts of natural gas, which it has robbed from anyone it could. Britain is relatively innocent in this because Germany has filled up all its gas storage sites with gas, while in the UK, we privatized, sold off, and then demolished most of our gas storage. So,
well, one thing I think that your article hits at, that this discussion it really is going to have to dig into, is the dependence, particularly in the UK, on rentier models. Like, I mean, since the days of My Beautiful Laundrette, we've all known that basically London is where you go to clean your money. And that's how you've dismantled what little industrial infrastructure you really had. I mean, and I do remember in the Corbyn days when they were talking about reshoring, and I was like, well, but Britain's not America. You don't have like massive tracts of land and physical resources to do this with. You know, when you're talking about the scales of population of the 19th and early 20th century, and cough, cough, the largest empire the world has ever known, then that's a very different industrial world than, say, post-1970. So even then, you know, when I would hear the Corbynistas kind of try to deal with this, it seemed to me delusional. But your bourgeoisie and their representatives in the Tory party have been even more delusional. It was interesting to me because it seemed like a kind of neoliberal right-wing modern monetary theory was guiding Liz Truss's government, and it took like a day for people to be like, oh no, you're not an empire anymore, you can't do that, you don't actually have currency sovereignty, shut up. Like,
yeah, that is kind of, we don't have, it's kind of funny, there's a paradoxical thing where kind of American political culture has become obsessed with the deficit, while actually being a country which could literally just spend money endlessly. And obviously it would, you know, it wouldn't, the money wouldn't achieve everything in the same amounts as time goes on, but it could just spend and spend and spend and spend. The dollar wouldn't collapse at a greater degree than kind of the money was spent.
Right.
While Britain is a country which, you know, there was kind of the austerity period where we were meant to be fixing the deficit or whatever, but that failed basically. And then kind of since then, it's just been, well, you know, we there's not such this cultural blockade around deficit spending, but structurally as a country, we're not as capable of doing it as the US is.
Right. I mean, that makes perfect sense, though. I mean, because how can a country do deficit spending? This is the part of, like, I think a lot of the propositions of modern monetary theory are true because of conditions they don't talk about. The US, even if it's not China, is finishing tons of goods, and you have to pay for them in US dollars. So we can pump it out into the world, and we still are useful as a reserve currency because people need US goods or access to US markets. What the fuck does Britain produce?
Financial resources.
Exactly. And actually quite in often quite good ones. My favorite bourgeois financial analyst is actually Patrick Boyle. Better than anyone in America. I agree with you on that. But
universities.
Yes.
We import Chinese people for 3 years. And send
we
them
do
back
that
home.
too, though, and we can outcompete you on it. So, so you know, when are we turning you into Airstrip 1 again? Like,
when did that? I thought that happened. It's kind of actually been peeled back a bit lately because you've run out of planes.
Yeah, that's true, and it just seems like we don't care. I mean, I think Peter Zion, who not a person who I think is always correct. I think he's way too dismissive of China, even though I think sometimes he's a corrective to some of the left, like, over optimism about China. But I think he's right that the U.S. is realizing that, like, North America is integrated. We kind of don't need the rest of the world if we don't want to. And fuck you guys in Europe. like we can dump some cheap natural gas on you because you desperately need it. But
it was kind of interesting recently. I don't know if you saw, and this was kind of leaked in the Swiss press and could be false, but apparently kind of the US went to Ukraine and Russia and was like, you know, we can give, why don't we give Russia like 20% of Ukraine, which I guess would be the Donbass and then the land strip to Crimea. And obviously Ukraine and Russia both said no, but that's interesting because at least publicly facing, for anyone in Europe, any negotiation on Ukraine's borders is, you know, almost like religiously a sin. To say that is to go against kind of the whole concept of Europe and our liberal democracy and blah, blah, blah.
Yes, this is why.
It's to, as to, in American terms, it's to negotiate with terrorists.
It's actually quite interesting. During the run-up to this war, before it became a left-right cultural issue in America, I was actually surprised how much more hawkish the European press was in the American press, and how we were, despite the fact clearly it was in our interest to promote this war, how we were much more willing to be realpolitik about it. I mean, I still think that's true. I think once the next election happens, we could easily see the U.S. going, okay, we've given you a bunch of money. It's been great for our defense contractors who don't have us, running around the Middle East and Central Asia anymore. So, but let's be real here. Neither one of you can win. So, and I can see that. I wonder, I wonder how Europe would deal with that, because China has been taken aback by how Europe actually really cared about this. Like, they actually seemed surprised when it became clear that Europe was going back into the American orbit. And then they were talking about, we're going to have a much more independent Europe eventually. And I'm like, yeah, but also from long-term trends, you're going to have also a much less powerful and relevant Europe pretty quickly, actually. So what do you make of that? And how do we tie this into the trends of capital as a whole? I mean, like, we're kind of...
I think it's on one level very conceptually important for kind of Europe to defend Ukraine in an ideological sense, in that regardless of what's actually going on there, kind of Ukraine symbolizes Europe in the sense of kind of, these are the liberal Democrats and blah, blah, blah. And then Russia symbolizes everything which is not Europe, which is, this anti-democratic, anti-LGBT and blah, blah, blah. But also kind of on a capitalist level, the kind of European system operates as a business does on this kind of constant expansion. And this is an expansion which is quite careful. For instance, in Europe, in the European Union, we have the Schengen Agreement, which allows free movement and travel between countries. But by joining the European Union, you aren't automatically in Schengen. And so just now, Bulgaria and Romania are being allowed into Schengen, and Croatia is being allowed into the Euro just as the new year passed. And these processes, with the slow admission of peripheral countries into Europe, allow kind of accumulation and profit to occur in the center of Europe, with kind of the movement of cheap labor into the center and the movement of kind of extraneous capital into the peripheral. The Russian invasion of Ukraine threatens that because it makes a hard block on kind of the expansion of Europe. And that's, I think, why people are getting so incredibly horny about the idea of breaking up Russia into these little republics. Because if that happens, then basically Europe can expand ad infinitum. It can just kind of
all the way to the border of China. Yeah.
Sorry?
All the way to the border of China, basically.
Yeah. It can just gobble and gobble and gobble these peripheral states and engage in the same process it has with Romania and Croatia. Do you know what percentage of people of Bosnians live in Europe, but not in Bosnia?
No, I don't.
Less than half. less than half of Bosnians live in Bosnia.
Oh man, that sounds like Ireland in the 19th century. So
it turns out empires keep working the same.
Yeah, well, that's true. The thing is, from the American standpoint, NATO's great and all, particularly since there seems to be at least a significant contingency in the U.S. military who sees an inevitable fiery conflagration conflict on the Taiwan Strait. But it's also increasingly clear that in some ways we're beginning not to give a shit. Like that our partnership of, what Paul Maddock called like the Keynesian international, what our like Daniel Besner calls a transatlantic superstate, is like not totally in our interest anymore.
I mean, the US nearly came into very direct conflict with a NATO member with Turkey in Syria.
Right.
And Turkey really kind of pushed the envelope as much as it could under Trump, including bombing a US base, which had just been vacated a few hours before that.
Yes, I remember that happening. So it does seem like in many ways it's NATO seems like
and also kind of more, and perhaps even more importantly, and people probably don't know this, at least probably, like in 2018, Russia killed hundreds of Turkish soldiers in Idlib, and everyone basically didn't care and got over it.
It was the machinations of what was going on in Syria was lost on most of the United States and both the pro and anti-imperial.
What is Aleppo?
Yeah. I mean, it's just like, oh, well, the Free Syrian Army good, Free Syrian Army bad, Assad good, Assad bad. That was the level of discourse here, even amongst the educated people of the left. Which, having just come back from Egypt myself at the time, I was like, y'all are dumb. like this is way more complicated. It's not one proxy war.
There's two options, and that's the Muslim Brotherhood or Baathism.
Right. But it's also like it's not one proxy war. There's also Saudi versus Turkish interest going on. There's Qatari versus and all these are bracketed out of the left's understanding of the proxy elements in Syria. And Turkey's been a wild card and really has sort of at times endangered NATO. At times you can also see Erdogan trying to push up and push back Russia's influence in what they see as the Turkish cultural sphere. That, there's a kind of different version of maybe some might call new Ottoman Eurasianism operating there.
Well, they do a very, very similar thing to Russia, right? Mm-hmm. Where Russia, well, up until the invasion of Ukraine, did this thing, and maybe it's the long-term plan in Ukraine, but they would do this invasion, this thing where they would invade a country which was full with pro-Russian minorities. They would take control of some regions, but not the full country. They would freeze the conflict, and then basically they wouldn't do anything, which is what Turkey did in Cyprus.
Mm-hmm.
And it's similar to what was going on with the Azeris, and it's what its plan was in Syria. Not only were they occupying large areas of northern Syria, but they were putting up Turkish flags, and they were teaching children Turkish, and so on and so on.
So this seems like, okay, we have a national level bourgeoisie in Turkey. I mean, we want to talk about tie this back into your point about the bourgeoisie. Turkish development has been a paper tiger, but a very effective one as a kind of third camp to pull people out of Chinese development money. Because one thing that people don't realize about U.S. imperialism is we have kind of not been building shit in places like Southeast Asia and in Africa. I actually told someone the other day, I was like, you think we have a lot of imperial business areas interests there? That's France. We just have military bases there. We don't really care. We're not in grand economic competition with China in Africa. If you actually were underground in Egypt or even in Central Africa, you'll see it's actually Turkey who is competing with China there.
And as we've discovered in the past couple of weeks, it turns out half the buildings in Turkey are made of fucking paper.
Right. Well, you have the same kind of crisis that you have with Korean development in the 90s, where it's fast because it's shit. You know, and that's not true now. I mean, that's not true for Korea now, but that was what Turkey's model is on. Now that we know that everything is basically, we're going to see I think we're going to see a lot of people going in and looking at Turkish construction and maybe going back to China, or although there we have additional complications because even internally, and again, the U.S. left is has a Manichaean view of this, so it can't talk about it correctly. But the Belt and Road Initiative hit real problems around COVID, around sovereign debt, around the ability of some of these periphery nations, even ones that are relatively well off for the reason to pay and service their own debt. And I don't mean this in a debt trap way. It was just, but it also wasn't, China wasn't doing it out of the kindness of its heart either.
Right. Yeah. There's a position between kind of China is intentionally like colonizing basically African countries and kind of the very pro-China view of them kind of like doing it kindly, which, you know, they aren't the Soviets, right? The Soviets did just pour development money out of their country as direct aid. Well, that's not something which China does.
China does not do that, and until Sri Lanka, China did not negotiate debt down either. It would have actually fairly favorable terms on its debt, but it also kept those terms secret. And so, you know, the only the actors who made the deals knew the terms. China was very, very. It actually was interesting because the anti-Chinese sentiment in Africa and the fears of like neo-colonialism there was predicated on the fact that that China was even more secretive in the way it cuts deals in the IMF, but the deals were often better.
Right. Yeah.
So it's like there was a kind of almost paranoia about public sentiment around this that like wasn't even justified. And it did give the West in some ways something to like scaremonger about.
But there's also the fact that Chinese capital is very like highly integrated with the rest of capital, right? It's not like a separate system. Like Nigeria got its first deep water container port, which first off, that's completely insane. Why did Nigeria only get its first deep water container port at the beginning of 2023?
Yeah, that's nuts.
And it's obviously Chinese built. But the ownership structure I find very interesting because it was part owned by Nigerian public entities. It was part owned by Chinese public companies, I think in about equal amounts as Nigerian entities. But there was also a small share, I think about 15-20%, which was a Singaporean private company. Well, private company. Singapore isn't like is a cyberpunk city where there's like not really any distinction between public and private, in the sense that everything in Singapore is private.
I think that this is, you know, we talk about the bourgeoisie, and maybe let's talk about its national planners also being incompetent, and the way the left. I guess, you know, I entitled this when I talked to you. I decided to entitle this Stefan Bertram-Lee on Stagnation, because that's really the theme of everything we're going to talk about today. But one of the things that seems very clear is the productive capacity of China is quite high, although leftists tend to exaggerate it, honestly. But it's also the popular press in America seems to like oscillate between it being the scariest superpower, productive powerhouse the world has ever known, and also it's a paper tiger, doesn't really exist, and is going to collapse tomorrow.
Yeah, and they're all dead. They've all been killed by COVID, and China's about to collapse. Blah blah blah.
You know, Zihan's always like, "Well, you're going to have a demographic collapse," which is true. Like the demographic collapse is coming, but it's not going to be like overnight.
And it'll be after hours.
Right.
That's the thing. Like people go on about Russia's in reference to the war. They go on about Russia's demographic collapse. But you know who's having a worse one? Ukraine.
Right.
And you know who's having a worse demographic collapse in China? Us.
Well, not so much the United States, but yes, Europe definitely has. I mean, this is. I think what you have when American reporters talk about this is they play on the difference between per capita and real numbers, and like the demographic collapse of Europe is happening right fucking now. The Chinese demographic collapse is going to happen in the next 10 years.
And it also relies on kind of China never having mass migration, which is like, well, why will that stay the same?
I've heard them try to justify that because China has never historically had mass migration, but I'm like,
but capitalism abolishes everything that's come before, mate.
Right. Well, this is the issue: is both a lot of the American left and a good portion of the American right really wants to pretend that China's not a capitalist country, and so they pretend that that's not going to happen. I don't know. It's not going to be an easy process for China. Yeah. Just I think right now there's been a continuity of anti-immigration policies in the United States, except for the very richest of Africa and a few other places, India. But it'd
be very interesting for kind of Americans, but Britain and kind of your idea of kind of white supremacy and global anti-blackness, but that Britain, with its withdrawal from the European Union, has managed to force out our most hated immigrants, which is dirty whites from Eastern Europe.
Yeah, that's what dirty white.
You get the good ones in, which are kind of Nigerians and Indians and so on.
Yeah, well, this was one of the things that it's funny because I think the idea of the discourse around this has been based off of the need for our bourgeoisie rentier in, which is tied to the liberal project and the Democratic Party. And I think we need to be, and that's where these ideas in the PMC come through because it's all structural. But there's a real sense in which they've abandoned any sense of reversing the Trump policies, because all the Trump policies were brutalization of what was already happening. That's true with China. That's true with immigration restrictions, etc. Now, there is a center part of the American establishment represented by people like Fareed Zakaria, who do want, Peter Zion's also one of these people, who do want a massive influx of immigration and to just push through a bunch of immigration liberalization laws. And one wonders, given that the Democratic Party cannot survive on a coalition of the black voter alone, since it's only 14% of the population, and all the rising POC stuff is predicated on Latin American immigrants and their descendants, mostly now.
Well, have you seen that the census is moving Middle Easterners out of white?
Yes, of course.
So Gene's a POC now.
The thing is, though, is with the Latin category, we've had this also major influx of people identifying as white. So there's yeah, I know. It's never made, our racial categories have never made fucking sense. I mean, that's but it's clear to me that the long-term trajectory of progressives and leftists in America, despite the fact that they put the leadership as predominantly of color, they're actually the whitest sub-demographic voting bloc in the country. It's sort of well, let's, it really is kind of every person we have on our side that is of color, we're going to make sure they're the stars and make sure they're women. The issue, however, is that in the short term, the Republicans are very unpopular, particularly after the Supreme Court ruling. But there's bombs that are going to go off because we can't seem to negotiate basic things like, how do we deal with the fact we have a debt bomb that has been enshrined into law that you can't even declare bankruptcy on these democratically dominated institutions? So is the Democratic Party going to save its base, which is largely college educated, from its donor base in university administration? And the answer so far is probably not. And so that's a time bomb waiting for the Supreme Court to detonate it, right? In the long term, it doesn't seem like U.S. Capitol has any ideas what to do. It's not clearly even picking a side. That's one of the things I've been sort of fascinated by, is like U.S. Capitol's alliance with the Republicans, at least from the Sun Belt, you know, the productive part, is no longer clear that it's going to be maintained. Conversely, U.S. rentier capital's reliance on the Democrats seems to be given, but it's no longer clear that they want to deal with the progressives anymore at all. That like they're moving away from loud diversity, equality and inclusion initiatives. That yes, they still exist. Yes, they're still kind of doing them, but it's a much smaller part of the economy. And since there's also a big push from U.S. capital to start reshoring production, I can guarantee you that those kinds of industries, even though they will be more ethnically and racially diverse, actually are not going to push like DEI methods for how they handle that.
Elon Musk was a Democrat until relatively recently, right?
Correct. Oh yes, I'm aware. Like Jeff.
No, I'm genuinely asking. I wasn't sure, but it felt like the truth, you know.
Yeah, no, he was a Democrat till he was beloved by the Democrats until about 4 years ago, and was a Democrat till about 2. Bezos is still a Democrat, but he made sure that all the redistribution plans got shat on. And I guess this may be a way to pivot something you're writing about now, which is like the incoherence of the current left to deal with this. Why we have a bourgeoisie that seems to just not care and just be hoarding, which indicates to me that they think there's a profitability problem. Like if it was it's not worth investing. It's just even with the cost of debt making all the asset appreciation not as valuable. And we're seeing the tech sector and that rentier sector get like, we're having tons of layoffs right now. Those people are getting jobs, but the tech sector is being, I wouldn't even say decimated, but very redrawn. But but again, to bring it back to your bourgeoisie being incompetent, they're literally just firing everybody and rehiring after they see what works and doesn't. That is what is happening. That is kind of, that level of incompetence is like, that never fucking happened in factories. Like, what are you guys doing? You don't even know what you need. Like,
it was interesting when I did the show on this on Sublation. Doug gave what I thought was quite a funny kind of like fake pro Elon Musk speech, and he was saying, you know, kind of one of the things he was saying is, you know, Elon Musk is going to take control of Twitter and, you know, make it better and blah blah blah. And I'm like, the sad thing is that we've fallen from a point where Elon Musk was going to take us to Mars to when it's not just the problem that he's moved from taking over Mars to take over Twitter, but even that he's taken over Twitter, he seemingly fails to change Twitter.
No, Twitter is continuing its long slow, Jeff, which was why I pointed people out, both pro and anti-Elon people, which is why the Twitter board forced Elon to buy it. If people forgot, they sued him to make him deliver on his promise. Elon's been much louder.
It is interesting with Elon how little freedom you can see that members of the bourgeoisie have. Yes. Elon is also someone who's got in trouble for, like, you know, because CEOs have like an obligation to investors to make a profit, basically. And he's got in trouble for tweeting the wrong stuff, like legal trouble for tweeting the wrong stuff from SEC, because it threatens the position of his investors. And again, he was the most richest man in the world, should be the most powerful man in the world. He was forced by some Twitter nerds to buy their bullshit because he said it on Twitter.
One of the things that I have come to look at is I now believe the richest man in the world list is really just a list of the nouveau riche who haven't figured out how to diversify and hide their assets. I'm sort of serious about that. But
no, go on.
No, but I think it's interesting how people have been focusing on Elon, and this I will point out, Facebook has been doing the same. All these companies have been floundering, and their sites are less and less useful. Twitter's been kind of dramatically failing because it turns out that, once again, in my mini list of David Graeber's many wrongs, his bullshit jobs thesis seems to not be true. That a lot of those jobs actually were important. It's just that even the people in them didn't understand what they were doing. Like, but without them, stuff starts not to work. So it's kind of funny. But yeah, I mean, I think that's why the left in America has gone on this PMC kick. You know, why revive a category from the 60s after Bernie loses? I mean, part of it is clearly politically motivated, but why revive that?
It's kind of it's college grads resentment about the college grads who got the jobs.
Exactly. You know, you know, PMC and PMC violence, but also like, and frankly, like even a lot of the people who are pro-workerist, when I look in the background, I'm like, you're a professor, aren't you? And they almost always are. Because I'm like, well, the productive blue collar part of American labor is less than 14% of its workforce. Like, that is highly automated. And now people are just redefining blue collar to mean services and just not college educated. So that they can maintain the hope. And I'm like, well, a college degree is not magic, my friend. I mean,
that's kind of the thing which is happening now, which it's not that kind of, you know, it's not the kind of the third way people were wrong, right? You can't just give everyone a university education and then suddenly everyone's middle class. Instead, we're just violently
proletariatizing.
Yes.
Right.
Various sectors, such as university lecturers, as I'm sure many people are aware.
3/4 of our lecturers are adjuncts, and temporary faculty. That's why all these temporary faculty unions. The biggest growth in American unions has been in TAs, and I point out that that's not really great for unions unless you're the leadership, because those people are only in the union for at most 6 years. And a lot of these people are not going to have academic jobs at the end of this. This is literally like a brief period in their life where they can do this before they enter the consulting workforce or just become some kind of service worker, particularly as coding in the tech sector is being hit by the fact that, we were talking off air about how unimpressive Chat GPT is, but how leftists who are trying to fight, you know, machine learning being so smooth are wrong. But I'm also like, it is going to take away a whole lot of shit labor, intellectual shit labor of just
which should be good,
which would be good. Like you think we'd be freeing ourselves up, you know, like there is a way in which Chat GPT would be a great technology. Is like, okay, well now I can if my kids were educated in school, for example, and knew what the fuck they were talking about, I could just be like, now I don't have to spend so much time marking their damn grammar errors so that they're comprehensible, because ChatGPT can fix it in 30 seconds. Now, Grammarly could already fix it almost as well for the last decade, but nonetheless, you know, it would help with a lot of things. Style becomes much more smooth. I'm not actually against this kind of augmentation of skills. It's not going to come up with anything new. Yeah. And it doesn't advertise itself as doing that. You know, we talk about the AI art, and it can't draw fingers because most people can't draw fingers. So it gets replicated in the art.
I mean, I think that's why I kind of got bored with AI art. Like, you get it, it's very amazing. I still have the program installed on my desktop, but what you want it to do is to produce pictures and combinations of kind of things which you haven't seen before, because otherwise I can just Google blah, blah, blah. But it's really, really bad at that. Like, that's the thing it struggles with most, to kind of do anything original. And of course, you can make it do stuff by, you know, you can make it do an Art Deco, like Orthodox icon. It can just, you know, it can mix two things together, and sometimes it does that okay. But anything beyond that, it struggles immensely.
Right. So in theory, we're freeing up the general intellect to do all kinds of other work, except that also what is happening with our bourgeoisie is no longer investing in human capital either. And you can see that in the fact that the developed world schools are falling to shit. And people think that's just in America, oh, the dumb American, but the trends in France and the UK are remarkably similar. We're just
we're the university sector here is like aggressively trashing the conditions of its workers, which is of course what you do in capitalism, blah blah blah. But the thing is, much more than other sectors, kind of trashing these conditions massively trashes the product,
right?
Because one of kind of the people just are no longer capable of doing these things. Like, you know, you have lecturers and so on who are doing all-nighters, who are sending emails at 3 a.m. being like, sorry, I haven't finished everything because I have too much work to do, so there's no lecture tomorrow, and blah, blah, blah. But also because so many people, and you want the best of the best to go and teach at universities, which are meant to be the UK's universities, at least a few of them are meant to be the best of the best. These people aren't going to go to university to teach when there are so many other better options available to them.
Oh yeah, the university becomes like the American public school, which is like very few really talented people do it, and if they do it, it's because they're an ideologically motivated weirdo like myself, or and I increasingly see this, they're the spouse or child of wealth, and then you have
they're living with guilt,
right? Yeah, exactly. Or they're incompetent, and that's why they got the job. Like, it is like, oh, well, this was a D student in the high school and college, and now they're a teacher. That's real.
They'll produce some more B students,
right? And then you have and I increasingly work with people who do the job, who are spouses of people with better jobs, and then that's it. That's all who wants to do the job. Well, now you're seeing that in universities, because it's like 3/4 of the thing is either TA or adjunct lecturer. The only people who are going to do that are people who are desperate, are people who do it for some other reason. And it's going to, ironically, when people are like, well, why is education getting whiter? I'm like, well, if I was some POC bourgeoisie or professional person, why in the blue fuck would I, in my first generation, let anyone do that? We haven't accumulated enough wealth to just have it wasted on maintaining a decrepit public sector, which is
right.
also...
I mean, the only thing keeping the university sector going is its mystique, because at the moment, you know, any other job. So it takes what, at least 7 years of training to get a PhD, probably 8.
And actually, the less valuable your PhD is, the longer the training regime tends to be. So like English and history tend to take 11 to actually finish your dissertation and everything in the States. It's crazy.
So, and what other job after 8 years of training, then
and $100,000 of debt here?
Yeah, here too. Then gets you a job which pays basically entry level and has the security of an entry level job elsewhere. And the situation that adjuncts are in. Why would anyone do that apart from the mystique?
And here, by the way, TAs have insurance, adjuncts don't. Like, no one's going to do it unless they absolutely have to. And I know so many doctoral students are just like, I'm not barely motivated to finish because I know there's literally nothing for me when I get out, except for hopefully I can totally change from what I trained in and go work for the private sector by having analogous skills. And as I pointed out to people, the private sector right now is not particularly innovative, but neither is the university. Even in STEM, most of the past major scientific breakthroughs have been done, even if they were done in the university, either through DARPA directly, that's the defense, or through DARPA contracts with universities. That's where GPS comes from. That's where the internet comes from. Yeah, that's where this lithium shit comes from. It's like our bourgeoisie has not lived up to this. I actually think since the 30s. I do think that like James Burnham.
So the last two productive forces of capitalist innovation in the world are the US military and the Chinese Communist Party.
Correct. Basically, and the US military also is holding our state together. It also protects world trade.
Do you know that in Britain over winter we had to have our military driving our ambulances?
Oh wow. Y'all are fucked. I know I play this. I hate the English on Twitter so much, but lately I've been like, things are really, really dire there, and I no longer feel like shitting on them.
Well, it's just kind of, it becomes less fun to hate on us, right? If we're losers.
Yeah, it was better when it was like, oh, it's our older brothers, and like the reason why it's interesting because the American left was dominated, interestingly, by British and France ideas for forever, even though they were cleaned up through our universities. And in the past, say since the DSA actually, and then when Corbynism just went tits up. Despite the large proliferation of conspiracy theories about how it was, the military and Zionists who destroyed Corbyn, and I'm like, well, it also didn't help that he was incoherent on Brexit.
I mean, it didn't help that after some Russian secret agents came and poisoned, tried to murder a guy in some kind of chemical operation in our country, he was like, well, maybe it wasn't Russia.
Yeah, I mean, it was just. The Corbynistic project also, I was very unpopular for saying this in America, but I was like, it's also not viable. Like, they don't really have a reindustrialization plan to return the unions.
Intellectually, it was really completely lacking, which makes sense because it didn't start as a political project, right? It was completely ad hoc. Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell were not planning to win the leadership election. No one was planning for them to win the leadership election. They just happened to win it.
Kind of like Trump.
If you compare it to the left in France, so and it was, I discussed this on TIR with a guy from La France Insomnie. The French left has an actual foreign policy plan which is genuinely different to the French right, but also works with the structure of France as a current imperialist country. As in, their left strategy focuses on African France, but hopefully being able to transform, to not disengage with this place, but to hopefully transform this relationship from an imperialist one to a cooperative one with the rest of the French world. And obviously this could completely fail and burn or whatever and just be imperialism too, blah, blah, blah.
But it has a plan.
Yeah, and one that connects us to France's national character as the peculiar imperial state it is. Corbynista foreign policy was vague stuff about Bolivia, which has nothing to do with the UK historically, has nothing to do with the UK as an imperial power. An actual kind of left kind of foreign policy in the UK would be about the Commonwealth, would be about British Africa, would be about the British Caribbean and so on, and having relationships and hoping to transform our relationships with these countries. This was not at all what the Corbynista foreign policy was.
It's similar to the American left. There's no, there's a facile anti-imperialism that will
America out of everywhere.
Bruh.
You could obviously just do that, right?
Yeah, I mean,
the biggest imperial power in the world could just leave,
and even the places would want it too. That's the other thing. It's do you realize what we're holding together? There's a reason why China's decoupling being accelerated by the Russia-Ukraine war, which it clearly didn't expect. This is another thing where I was like,
the Russians told them they weren't going to do it the week before, which is hilarious, and then they were mad about it.
Right. Because it totally scuttled their long-term, it accelerated the problems of Belt and Road to the point the Belt and Road is no longer really viable. at least
And it
not
also
in the
kind of
immediate future.
ruined China's ideological strategy, which was to say, you know, us and Russia and the rest are this ideological bloc based on the very flimsy premise of we follow the UN Charter while the USA doesn't. And of course, Russia massively violated the UN Charter when they went into Ukraine. And I mean, I'm not particularly regretful of that because hopefully it makes China actually have a slightly less flimsy ideological premise. But yeah, it ruined that for them.
Yeah, well, and then what replaced it in the American context was like nonsense about BRICS. Like, well, India and Saudi Arabia and all this is going to align with Russia, and they're going to have a currency block, and it's going to finally kill the petrodollar. And I'm like, no, it isn't. No, it's not. Actually, while what Putin did is quite smart, it's going to actually make the dollar more valuable, which I'm one of the only people on the left that predicted, because I actually understand economics, and these dipshits believe whatever comes out of Michael Hudson's mouth.
I mean, people talk about, you know, as if Russia decoupling from the US capital is a thing which has happened, when it's not. Like Russia is exporting like raw aluminum, as you say, aluminium, to the US, so the US can reprocess it into weapons, which they sell to Ukraine. Like Russia still has kind of like a semi-colonial capitalist character compared to the USA, like in a direct relationship with each other.
Yeah. Yes, it has complicated certain things, and it's very much risks the international food markets. Although
that doesn't fucking suck for us. It sucks for fucking people who don't matter.
Right. Well, you know, yeah. Of which Britain is soon to be, just so you know. But, you know,
did you hear about the British food crisis that we had?
I heard we heard a little bit about it.
It was a deeply fake crisis. There was actually, you know, you'd go to the supermarket and like 20% of the things wouldn't be on the shelves. But this just meant we'd gone from like 20 varieties of crisps. What do you call them? Chips.
Yeah.
We went from like 20 varieties of chips to like 15. So it really wasn't much of a crisis.
We've had massive food inflation, but what's interesting about that is people think that means we're running out of food. And I'm like, no, North America is food. Like, if we shut our borders entirely, we'd have a lot of problems, but food would not be one of them. And neither would energy. The reason why we do is we have these issues of both scarcity and of some of it has to do with climate change. Some of it has to do with you know, animal pandemics, bird flu. A lot of it has to do with the fact, however, that our capitalists just go and like sell shit to other countries to make at inflated markups to make up for it. And like they know we have enough food here because we do, and we are eating the prices mostly on the poor. You know, like, and even now, like inflation has dramatically slowed, except for food. But no one's starving.
Food inflation here is insane.
I think ours is mostly now in eggs. It's finally beginning to slow down, but it wasn't part of the Fed's. Like, the Fed doesn't do anything about food inflation. It's never even been that factored. Like, the U.S. government doesn't factor it into its inflation index. It's like, what? Yeah, food is in a separate inflation index from the general inflation index on consumer goods.
What the fuck?
Yeah. Oh,
I thought you guys were fat. I thought you loved food.
We do love food, but it's like we've had very little inflation for a long time, but food inflation is more sporadic and regional than that.
That's baffling to me, because for me, like, food is like the most basic item on the like a consumer price index.
Well, the consumer price index is mostly about like non-necessary goods. So housing isn't in it, and energy isn't in it either.
Wow, that is very American.
Yeah, I mean, like, so like
it's that kind of ideological thing of like, no, we're actually all fine. We all have our house, which we definitely own, and we have enough food, blah, blah, blah. What we're really concerned with is how much the big television costs.
Right.
And the big truck.
The thing is, most of us don't have a house.
Yeah, no, that's what I'm saying. That's why it's
and education inflation and healthcare inflation have been astronomical, although right now they're not. Actually, I think last year was one of the only times in my history where general inflation outpaced healthcare inflation, like by a good amount, because our hospitals are basically cracking. So I mean, you have this weird picture in the States where things are better, like things seem really dire here, but people don't really understand how dire they are everywhere else. And so,
do you want to hear an interesting fact which shows kind of how the structural kind of imperialism of the British healthcare system is kind of clearly on its last legs?
No, but I am interested.
I recently found out that the NHS imports doctors from like Malaysia or whatever, who do like 9-month residencies, and they're paid nothing. But they come to practice in the UK for 9 months or a year or whatever, for the sake of basically, exposure, as they say on the internet.
Experience and
but this only works as long as the NHS has this prestige, and as long as it's engaging in these extreme stopgap measures, it digs itself out, basically.
I was also reading that the cost of the NHS to the average Briton was going up dramatically. Is that true? Like the way Americans parse these things is sometimes very deceptive. So,
well, I mean, that's kind of, I guess that's not how we would even say it in the UK, but basically NHS funding is something that you're not allowed to cut in government budgets. Not legally, but ideologically, morally, politically, it's impossible. So there's been no NHS cut since 2010, while everything else has been cut. Basically, when other stuff gets cut, NHS funding stays the same. And when other things are frozen, NHS funding increases. So NHS funding as a part of the state budget, as a relative share of the state budget, has gone up every year for about 15 years. I mean, I think it's gone up basically my whole life. So it increasingly dominates public spending in the UK. It's kind of our last institution. We are like ideologically obsessed with it. Did you hear about us clapping?
Yeah, I heard about that.
It's almost pagan, I think, this clapping, because the NHS, was the NHS there to listen to the clapping? Like, does it permeate the air? Does it stand outside of my door? Is it omnipresent as God is?
Oh man, so I guess this takes us to, we've been talking about a lot of how the left has been just wrong. It's underestimated it's overestimated other powers. It doesn't understand its own bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie isn't living up to what the left thought it would even do. But in America, that's led to stuff like leftists talk about like techno neo-feudalism and a totally rentier economy. At the very moment where that ended, like we started pulling, like it seemed like, oh, okay, there will eventually be inflation if we only rely on rentier shit. So let's start pulling it back as policy from the Fed. And you even started seeing that from the Democrats in some ways, because they're like, oh, we got to start investing in actual production after this the baby food crisis and the chip crisis, both of which did illustrate how bad we've let reinvestment into physical production get in certain sectors.
Kind of sorted out the insulin shit, haven't you, a little bit?
Yeah, we have. But it's interesting because now, as the left was doing this at the same moment this was happening. So it's like, again, it's like the left is listening to people like Yanis Varoufakis, who've just been, in so much that they've ever been right, have always been behind the moment while everybody thought they were ahead of it.
I mean, Varoufakis, as a left commentator, obviously he has the virtue of kind of having more experience than us, but his experience
is failure.
A massive total failure of driving directly into a fucking brick wall, of having a whole political project which, by the way, was very. It's called. They were very influenced by the Essex School of Discourse Studies, which is where me and Anton went to university.
Mm-hmm.
But regardless, yeah, they got into power. They had these big threats against the European Union. They stepped into the boardroom to negotiate with the EU. They were like, if you don't give in, we're going to fuck off. You need to do this. You need to give us this, blah, blah, blah. And the European Union said no.
Yeah, which was predictable that they would say no. And then they got a worse deal. It's like, so you threaten Grexit, which, by the way, the leftists in America who were like, and these were not just Marxist, also the Keynesians were like, well, they could just leave and have their own economy. And I'm like, what does Greece produce that we would buy so it could float its currency?
Fava beans.
It's going to float it's going to float a currency of international trade, or it's going to be able to become an autarky overnight in production with no investment. What the fuck are you on? Oh, they just ideologically peg the currency to the dollar. Ideologically peg the currency. They peg the currency to the dollar because they have to buy shit from other countries in dollars. You dipshit.
Yeah, and obviously, kind of, Greece was fucked one way or another.
Yeah,
but
no good way.
with that situation, still managed to like careen into his wall as fast as they could.
They made it worse. Like, and then we just all moved on and pretend like it didn't happen. And and in America, Jeremy Corbyn made the rounds recently, like talking about Lula, and he was on Democracy Now, and I was like, why are we obsessed with talking to losers? Why are we asking him about Brazilian politics? Why don't you get someone from the fucking Workers' Party who speaks English? I'm sure there's plenty. Or at least someone from who is from Brazil and knows its internal politics. Why? Because of a tweet he made about the international stakes of Lula, and I'm not anti-Lula, although I do think the excitement about him is like the excitement about most of the pink wave part, whatever, is vastly overstated, because Party Trabajo actually didn't win that much. Lula himself did, but his party's still kind of, in sketchy water. And while they have been able to come down, they don't have
parliament.
Huh?
They don't have parliament.
No. And while, yes, they were able to get rid of the right insurrectionaries in a way that like Americans didn't, Bolsonaro's party is still actually pretty powerful. So all this is sort of interesting to me, because it's just like we don't want to be correct. And we were talking about BRICS. Well, there is this weird thing in America where they're just like, well, BRICS is going to become a competitor to the dollar because China and Russia are going to band together. And I'm like, why on earth? Like, what China's going to use Russia's market as its dumper of last resort the way it uses the West? Do you think there's enough purchasing capacity in Russia? Even though Russia is resource rich, I think there's been a lot of like downplaying the kinds of things that Russia has. But as a consumer power, no way. Like, and then, well, maybe India. India and China are strategically at odds, and the shit in Russia doesn't change that at all, and hasn't changed, even though they're both ostensibly on Putin's side on this.
I mean, India also still has a GDP per capita comparable to sub-Saharan African nations. Yes,
and even that, like, its military goals are actually directly at odds with China. Like, it's there's been no detente between Modi and Xi at all during this Russian period at all, like none. And so it's just it's amazing to me that we have a bourgeoisie out to lunch, but we have a left that doesn't understand anything. That just seems to be addicted to not looking at things as they are to develop a policy for how to deal with them. Like, it's all like smoke and mirrors and Overton window shit. And in America, for example, you still hear like, well, socialism is more popular than it was. Here's a worrying trend. Both socialism and capitalism have gone down in popularity in the United States. And like no one's been reporting on that. Like the Pew did.
It's nihilism time, bros.
Yeah, it's like it's nihilism or something worse. So it's just like no, socialism dropped 6 points in favorability, capitalism dropped about 10. There are more people who oppose capitalism than support socialism.
It's a useless figure, and
it's dumb.
If we don't know what people mean by socialism,
and we don't. I mean, in America, a lot of the people in the DSA seem to actually believe the rights characterization of any social goods is socialism. So socialism is like Medicare for all and free college. So I'm like, oh, okay. So we now have the NHS and the German university system.
Right. That makes like Spain a socialist country.
Yeah. Woo! Like, you know, so I find this kind of like ironic, and it's also ironic that like the big debates on the American left right now are about like tactics, about whether or not you support the squad or want to have a force to vote. And I'm like, motherfucker, we forced the vote in 1993. There was a vote on socialized medicine before many of you dipshits were born. It lost. Guess what happened? You didn't replace the progressives, Democrats with more progressive Democrats. The Republicans took the fucking house. Like, what?
Force the vote is really so funny to me because obviously the UK left and the European left has these spectacular images of if we just do this, then something great will happen. There's an obsession, for instance, on the UK left of having a one-day general strike. And I spent some years in Greece where annually they have a one-day general strike, and it really doesn't matter. But you know, that's a one-day general strike. You know, it's kind of cool. It requires like a lot of organization among workers, blah blah blah. But it seems the American equivalent of that, of the obsession, is this fucking force the vote shit, which literally I don't really know how the US system works, but it's like as if the UK, everyone on the UK left was obsessed with kind of like a backbenchers motion in Parliament.
Yes, that's exactly what it is.
To vote on something which is going to get rejected, so that you can be angry at the people who reject it.
Yeah, and then run a campaign against them. And I'm like, well, the other problem with that,
you just have their public statements, right? Like what?
Right. Well, the other problem with that is like you would have some situation like the situation in with the railroad strike here, where people who clearly probably don't support it can still pass a bill that forces it through, knowing that it's going to get gutted in the Senate anyway. So everyone has cover. You still don't know who in the House opposes Medicare for all or not, busts up a vote. And nor do you have any way.
It's really funny that it's almost like an epistemic strategy.
Mm-hmm. It's a parliamentary procedure, except well, we don't have parliament, and our Congress is weirder, but it's a congressional procedure based on parliamentary rules to raise consciousness to change the voting pattern. That's all it is, and it is the biggest debate of the American left.
It's like a really degenerate idea of kind of like a Foucauldian, reveal the violence in the system.
Yeah, yes, that as if run by children.
Yeah.
So it's and no wonder, our left is just dying, of success. They defeated Trump. Now they should be victorious, except, and, Biden used some talking points in them in 2020. And now they're going to basically not, the DSA is declining in numbers. The unions are actually shrinking, not growing. As part of the larger population of the workforce, yes, they did grow in raw numbers if you compared it to the previous years, but not actually comparing it to any time before 2017. Like, basically every talking point the left has right now is just fundamentally not true. It's just not true. So and when it is true, it's stupid. So, or petty, like the force to vote stuff. It's just such a minor thing to be that obsessed with. And it also assumes that like the electorate can really affect the electors, despite the fact that we actually know that that's not the case, and that's part of the argument for doing it.
This kind of minutia.
Yeah, it's very strange.
Like like the vote happens, and then the corporate media don't really report on it, and then that's that, mate.
Yeah, that's it. Like. The vote happens, it gets into the Senate. Well, our Senate's staggered, so you can never throw it out all at once. So you can't necessarily. It'll take 7 more years to change the Senate to do anything about it. Like and that's not dealing with the fact that we have federalized election laws, so our election laws are different from state to state, and there's 50 fucking states. Like. I mean, Europeans often, when I actually explain how the U.S. works, they're like, what? I'm like, yeah, it's worse than you think. like it makes less sense. Like, you guys have national things. We don't. We're like our national government is an insurance program that kills people. Like,
I mean, you can always dab on us, though, about it, because at least you don't have bishops in your parliament.
Well, yes, that's true. You guys, even though you are arguably the first fully bourgeois nation state, didn't even finish your bourgeois revolution.
Yeah.
Like, and people are like, well, it doesn't matter. I think isn't the largest man in Britain still an estate tax holder or something?
I mean, I think the largest landowner is just the royal estate.
Yeah. So it's just like, yeah, you didn't even finish your bourgeois revolution. Like, what are you talking about? And what's weird is how even left-wing Brits get defensive about that. They're like, the Queen, blah, 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 blah. And the Canada's like, well, the Queen's the only reason, like, it's the only reason you, don't massacre the indigenous? Like, so you... So
well,
like,
that's spread by kind of the anti-American white supremacy, global anti-blackness, blah, 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 people in the US, right? Where they say, actually, the American Revolution was a bad thing.
Yeah. Ignoring the fact that the southern colonies that were slaveholding colonies were the most loyal to the Britain, like, which you just have to ignore that. The Georgia, like the South. One of the things about our weird accent is we maintained like these Britishisms for a long time as part of a cultural allegiance, so that our planter class could claim to be aristocrats. Yeah. Like it was, yeah, there was all kinds of concessions, like really bullshit concessions made over and over and over again in the U.S. history from
I mean, it's exactly because of the North American crisis that Britain was set on the road to abolish slavery.
Right, yeah, that's the other thing is like the whole Britain abolishing slavery in the colonies was partly economic and partly like also it was a PR campaign. So... And it still took them, 60 years to do?
I mean, after the American Revolution, it wasn't long at all. And then the time
1830, I think, was the last British colony that had slavery, right?
I don't think so, but okay. I don't know. Certainly, the anti-slavery campaign continued until then, but it was against kind of trying to impede other people's shipping, which, of course, is kind of like made out as a moral thing, but you can just take it as, it's not letting people in on the game that we're not in.
Right. And it's not like, Rhodesia and South Africa didn't happen after that. Like,
right. Though I mean, Rhodesia
they weren't slaves.
So. Rhodesia did secede from the British Empire so they could be more racist.
That's true. But
they're the real ones who actually did that, unlike America.
Although Cecil Rhodes was still Prime Minister of South Africa, so he was
like the big guy in Britain for a while.
Yeah, it's interesting when people talk about this because it's just My other favorite thing is like when MMTers try to describe an economy and they always like talk about Rhodesia, but like we can use it for good.
Wow, I had no idea. But
Yeah,
no, I'm definitely not a monarchy apologist. I am patiently waiting for Cromwell too.
I think I'm more amused by the Canadians who are just like, well, if the crown falls, our treaties with the indigenous people fall, and I'm like, but why would they have to? You could honor them.
Oh yeah, like you're completely
like you could just as your parliament could honor the already standing treaties with the crown. I don't know why that's so fucking hard. Whatever.
I was having vague dreams of in 30 years kind of Russian hyperliberals in the Donbass and Crimea doing like Ukrainian land acknowledgements.
Oh man, the funny thing is, even in like if you watch American TV shows made by indigenous people, they make fun of land acknowledgements. It's literally an arts and academic culture thing only.
Yeah, it's one of those things which is done for the sake of the people who do it themselves and for no one else.
Yeah, because it really doesn't matter. Like it doesn't change a goddamn thing.
It is the fakest thing ever. It is hopes and prayers boiled down.
So I guess we have to ask ourselves, what do Marxists do if we no longer believe that there's a coherent left? We no longer believe that the bourgeoisie like is able to deliver on its historical mission. And fuck, where are the workers? We haven't talked about them. Like the left doesn't even agree on who they are. So
yeah. I mean, my hope, belief, whatever, be the exhaustion of the bourgeoisie is not that they've failed their historical mission, but that they've just finished it. And this is the end. And that we've finally reached a point in kind of productive capacity where socialism at a relatively low stage is possible. I mean, I don't know what you think on the matter, but
I tend to think that we either are there or we're actually past there and we're exhausting the resources that make that possible.
But like, I'm not a person who thinks that 20th century socialism could have succeeded if instead we'd been syndicalist or we'd been anarchist or whatever.
Yeah, well, no, I think every
system failed because we couldn't produce enough stuff.
I think there are both productive problems and organizational problems, and I think it is telling that it was a capitalist world that was able to use things and develop things like Bogdanov's basically proto-systems theory gets picked up by cybernetics theory. Like we used a lot of the inventions of the Soviet Union in ways they couldn't. And why couldn't they? All their production was tied up into the military at one point, kind of necessarily, actually. Although after the nuclear umbrella, maybe that wasn't as necessary. But and two, like we hadn't reached the kinds of technological development that would enable some of these things to be viable large scale systems. It wasn't just that they weren't doing it for political reasons. It was also that they couldn't figure out how to do it cheap enough yet.
And we're doing it all in fucking pen and paper.
Right. Whereas now our constraints are different. It's like, well, we're going to use up too many resources if we don't start transitioning soon. And people's imagination is like, growth or degrowth. And I'm like, well, no, like we really should be thinking like, how do we completely change how we're utilizing these resources? We're going to have to utilize some resources on an expanded capacity, and others, like, I don't know, wasting plastic on bullshit, we could dramatically reduce. Like,
right. I mean that's the thing with oil, right? It's not something we should keep in the ground, but it's something that it's far too precious to go in cars because we need we need to use it to make plastics, which are one of the most incredible technologies we've ever produced. But we don't have a method of producing them outside of oil.
Yeah, not at scale. Like, what you find is when people start, well, we can produce vegetable plastics, and like, yeah, and then use all of our food land. Like when you guys thought we could replace oil with ethanol, which was a terrible idea if you just thought about growing capacity. Like, but yeah, you know, I think this is a problem, and I do often ask myself, like, why are people still leftist? Why are they still, you know, like, not that I don't think we should be. I think we should be, but I'm like, just looking at what the left right now produces. Like, why are people attracted to this, since it seems to valorize losers? Almost everything it predicts is wrong. Like, even if it's right about and I'm like, well, basically what is making the left seem viable isn't itself, it is the exhaustion of capital. Like, that's what's the only thing that makes it seem viable. Itself is just one long string of failures right now. But what it opposes is also fucking up even bigger. So like, it has power to fuck up. Like, the left is just wrong. You know, when capital fucks up, people die. So, you know, we haven't had the American left has not had the responsibility of lives in a long time. So,
oh fuck! I saw some. There was some in Seattle's Capital District. Someone had like posted up loads of pictures of this other person. I think they're both non-binary, about how they're abusers, blah 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 blah, radical terms, blah blah blah. And the top comment I saw in reply was like, "I hope these people can sort all this out so that they can get control of domestic politics."
Oh man, yes. Well, on that note, thank you so much, Stefan. I'd love to have you back on the show. What would you like to plug? You know, we've been talking kind of vaguely about 2 of your articles in Sublation, but you got a lot of other projects. So,
yeah. Well, I guess the nihilism book coming at some point with Sublation Press it is called How to Not Be a Teenage Nihilist, which reflects, I mean, it's relevant to what you were just saying of why does anyone bother to be a leftist at all, of my increasingly kind of nihilistic politics that kind of reached a final lowest point when I went to Rojava, and how the experience of Rojava and of a living successful left, which is taking control of domestic politics and is doing various things for the good, dragged me out of that hole. And how hopefully in this text I can try and communicate some of the same feelings without you having to go to Syria for 8 months.
Yeah, that's probably a great idea, to not go to Syria for 8 months. But thank you so much, Stefan, and have a great evening there in good old fading Britannia.
I'll give myself a treat and put the heating on.
All right. All right. Have a good evening. Oop.